Hey everyone, welcome back to Polished Timber. I'm back with another epoxy table build, and at this time I'm working with some beautiful walnut, wood and clear epoxy resin. If you've seen my previous projects, you know I love using resin to bring out the natural beauty of the wood, and this table is no exception. I'll be walking you through the usual process, like preparing the wood, mixing the epoxy, and pouring it for that smooth, glassy finish. If you're ready to see how this one turns out, let's jump right in and get started. Now that I've got my slabs, it's time to measure them against the frame. First, I'll check the dimensions and positioning to make sure everything lines up perfectly. But before I move forward, I also need to measure the squareness of the frame. Getting the angles right here is crucial as it ensures everything fits as it should. I'm using the frame as a guide to draw lines on the slab so I know exactly where the edges of the table will be. This is a pretty important step because it ensures that the slabs fit perfectly within the form. It also gives me a good visual of how the table is going to look once it all comes together. I'm making sure to take my time here to get everything lined up just right. Now that I've got the slabs marked, it's time to cut away the excess with a track saw. And honestly, it feels great to finally have one of these. In my last epoxy table, as you know, I used the construction table saw and it bogged down trying to do these cuts, but the track saw is a total game changer. The cuts are way cleaner and more accurate, and it's so much easier to work with. If you're new to building epoxy tables, I'd say a track saw should be one of the first tools you get even before you get a table saw. It'll make cutting a whole lot easier and save you a ton of time. Plus, you'll get better results with less effort. I absolutely love these walnut slabs I picked up for this project. They've got such incredible character. The grain patterns, the natural color variations, it's also beautiful. Every time I see a slab like this, I get excited because I know it's going to turn into something truly unique. These pieces have a lot of personality and I can already tell they're going to look amazing once everything comes together. Right before filming this video, I installed new LED lighting in my shop. Because of that, you might notice some color variation in the video and a few lines that pop up in certain shots. It's something I'm still working on adjusting, but I wanted to give you a heads up so you're not confused, and thanks for understanding. I really like the vibrant colors in this walnut. At first, I was thinking about using black epoxy to make the darker parts stand out, but after looking at the wood, I decided to go with clear epoxy instead so the natural colors could really shine through. Later in the video, you'll see me sealing the wood in preparation to use black epoxy. I usually seal the surface so the epoxy doesn't stain the wood, but as I was preparing the epoxy, I decided on going clear. And I think the clear epoxy is really going to bring out the best in this walnut. As you can see, I don't have a long enough track for my saw. To get around that, I have to cut up to the halfway point and then reposition my track to finish the cut. It's not a huge deal, but definitely adds a little extra step in the process. Unfortunately, one downside of buying a cheaper track saw is that they don't sell tracks separately, which means I can just grab a longer one to make my life easier. Now, I do think this track is universal, so I could probably buy a different brand's longer track to use with it, but I'm not 100% sure it will work. As you can see, I'm trying to strap down the wood so it doesn't fall down. But as I'm doing it, the wood splits and falls down. I was lucky with this though, because it could have split underneath way worse than it did. Fortunately for me, it split on the outside and I only had to retrim it to make it fit as I wanted to. As a note, I've started scripting my videos because I realized I had some issues with staying on track in my last few projects. I think having a script will help me stay focused and make the content clear for you all. Hopefully you'll notice the difference and appreciate the change. I know I still have some work to do on how I present things, but I'm learning as I go. Practice makes perfect, right? I'm excited to keep improving and bring you better content with each video. Next up, I'm going to remove the bark from the slabs. I'm using a chisel for this, which helps me carefully scrape it off without damaging the wood underneath. The reason I'm doing this is that the epoxy resin will bond much better to the wood without the bark in the way. As much as I love the look of the bark, it adds a nice contrast to the wood and gives the piece a lot of character. I'm a bit worried about how well the resin will stick to it over time. The more projects I do, the more I'm tempted to keep the bark on because it really does look great. But after thinking it through, I'm concerned that the epoxy might detach from the bark in the long run, which could cause issues. I may want to try leaving the bark on in a future project though. Maybe as a failed project, if you guys are interested in seeing how it turns out. For now, I'm removing it to ensure everything sticks properly and lasts. After using the chisel to remove the bark, now I'm moving to the grinding wheel to get everything down to the bare wood. The chisel helped me get rid of most of the bark, but the grinding wheel makes it much easier to smooth everything out and remove any remaining bits. This tool really speeds up the process and ensures I'm left with a clean surface for the epoxy to bond to. While the chisel did the job of breaking away the bark, the grinding wheel is perfect for refining the surface and getting it ready for the next step. It's time to build the form for the table. And this time I'm switching things up a little bit. Instead of using Tyvek tape like I did on my last table, I'm just going to use mold release and caulk. I found that applying the tape over the form can be really time consuming, especially when you're working with a large table like this one. It's about 180 centimeters by 90 centimeters. That's about 71 inches by 35 inches. So there's a lot of surface area to cover. Not to mention, the tape can get pretty expensive when you're doing big projects like this. By using just mold release and caulk, I'm hoping to save some time and money while still getting the same result. The mold release will help the epoxy peel off easily once it's cured, and the caulk will seal any gaps. I think this will work out just fine, and I'm curious to see how it holds up. So stay tuned to see how it turns out. I'm using a lot of caulk here, between the mating surfaces of the melamine and around the corners. This is to make sure I don't have any leaks when I pour the epoxy. The caulk will help me create a solid area, especially in the seams where melamine pieces come together. Of course, I'm also using screws to hold everything in place and keep the form intact. But the main reason for the screws is to make sure the sides of the form press together and squeeze the caulk into the seams properly. This will ensure the caulk seals everything up tight and prevents any epoxy from leaking out when I pour it later. Sealing the form for an epoxy table is a critical step in the process because it prevents any resin from leaking out. If the form isn't sealed properly, epoxy can seep through the cracks or gaps in the form, which can make a mess and waste material, obviously. Not to mention, it could cause uneven pours or potentially ruin the final look of the table. Even small leaks can be a big problem because once the resin starts to escape, it's kind of hard to contain and you'll be left with a sticky mess to clean up. Another reason sealing the form is so important is that it ensures the epoxy will fully adhere to the wood without any unwanted gaps or issues. When you seal the form and the wood surface, it creates a clean, smooth surface that helps the resin bond properly and stay in place. Without the seal, the epoxy might pull away from the wood in certain areas or form weak spots that could affect the table's overall integrity. Sealing helps you get that perfect finish without the fear of the epoxy finding its way out or creating issues during the curing process. Lastly, sealing also helps you preserve the form itself. Epoxy can be very sticky, and without sealing the form, it could become permanently attached to your mold, which would make demolding a real headache. By taking the time to properly seal everything, you not only avoid all these potential problems, but you also set yourself for a cleaner, smoother, and more successful project. It might seem like an extra step, but trust me, it's well worth it. Next, I'm placing the wood pieces into the form, but they're pretty heavy and I want to make sure I position them just right. Since I need a little extra help to get everything in place, I asked my wife to give me a hand. Having an extra set of hands really makes this step easier, especially when the pieces are as heavy as these. We're taking our time to make sure everything is aligned properly, so when the epoxy gets poured, everything will sit just how I want it. I'm also clamping down the wood to make sure everything stays in place. Since the wood will float in the resin and could shift around, the clamps are crucial to keep everything from moving while the epoxy sets. I want the pieces to stay exactly where I've positioned them, so the clamps will hold them securely in place as the resin cures. This step is important to make sure the final look is just right. But before I start clamping everything down, I'm sealing the wood with clear epoxy. Initially, I was planning to dye the epoxy black for the pour, but after thinking it over, I decided to go with clear resin instead. If I had known from the start that I'd be using clear epoxy, I probably wouldn't have sealed the wood first. But since I did, it's really important to pour the epoxy while the sealing coat is still uncured. This ensures a stronger bond between the two layers of epoxy. If I let the sealing coat cure fully before pouring, I could end up with a weaker bond, which I definitely want to avoid. I've got to say though, I'm really loving how the epoxy highlights the natural wood colors while sealing the surface. As soon as the clear epoxy goes on, the colors in the walnut pop and become even more vibrant, especially the darker parts of the wood. They really stand out and add so much depth to the piece, which I'm super happy with. Another thing to keep in mind when sealing is making sure that the edges of the wood are fully covered. This is especially important when you plan to use dye in the epoxy, because if the edges aren't sealed, the dye could seep into the wood. So getting a good even coat on all edges is key to avoid any surprises later on. European walnut, also known as Juglans regia, is a species of walnut native to Europe, prized for its rich color and dense, durable wood. The wood itself is highly regarded in woodworking for its strength, texture, and striking appearance. European walnut can range in color from light brown to deep chocolate brown, with some pieces even exhibiting purplish or reddish hues. The wood's distinctive color comes from a combination of factors, including the age of the tree, the specific environment in which it was grown, and the natural processes it undergoes and it matures. Where I live, the European walnut is a protected species due to its value and slow-growing nature. Over the years, walnut trees have been increasingly threatened by overharvesting, which has led to significant decline in their population. As a result, the government has put strict regulation in place to protect walnut forests. Trees can only be cut down with special authorization, ensuring that walnut resources are managed sustainably. This regulation helps preserve these trees for future generations, making sure that the wood remains available for high-quality products while preventing the depletion of the species in the wild. Now, it's finally time to clamp everything down, but before I go overboard with the clamps, I've got to use a little trick. I'm adding some softwood blocks as spacers between the clamps and the wood. The last thing I want is for epoxy to get on the clamps and make them stick to the table. That would be a nightmare. Imagine having clamps glued to your table forever, like some kind of unwanted permanent decoration. These softwood blocks are a simple fix, keeping the epoxy where it belongs and making sure I don't accidentally create a new problem while trying to solve an old one. Another reason for using these blocks is to avoid leaving any marks on the wood from the clamps. Trust me, you don't want those ugly clamp imprints on your beautiful wood. Of course, these blocks will stick to the resin too, and let me tell you, cleaning them off afterwards is like a bad date you just can't shake off. It's a total pain, but hey, it's all part of the process, right? Alright, it's finally time to pour. But before I can do that, I've got to mix the resin. You need to mix it for about 5 minutes, making sure to get everything even around the edges of the bucket. It doesn't sound like much time, but trust me, when you're holding the drill and stirring non-stop, those 5 minutes feel like an eternity. It's like time slows down by the end. Anyway, I decided to do the pour in 2 steps for this project, even though the epoxy I'm using can handle pours up to 5 centimeters or 2 inches thick, which is the thickness of the table. I did some experimenting on a smaller table with the offcuts from this. I'll be posting that video soon, but in that experiment I noticed that when I did such a thick pour, the resin bubbled up. I didn't want to take any chances with this big table, especially since I could already see bubbles forming in the resin. That being said, even though I did it in 2 pours, I still ended up with some bubbles where the 2 layers met. I think this might have happened because the first coat was already a bit too hard when I did the second pour. Has anyone else experienced this? If you have any insights or thoughts on this, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your experiences. I want to apologize again for the color changes in this video while looking at this pretty pour. I made some adjustments to my camera settings to get everything looking right, but it turns out I missed a few things. And that caused the color variation you're seeing. It's all because of those pesky LED lights. Anyway, I waited for the resin to harden for about 3 weeks before moving to the next steps. And like I mentioned earlier, removing the pine blocks I used for the resin was definitely a bit of a bear. As you can see, I had to chisel them out, which wasn't exactly the easiest job. But honestly, it's not as bad as it might seem. I know it looks like a hassle, but when I think about the alternative, having those clamps permanently stuck to my shiny new table, I'm definitely not complaining. I'll take a little chisel work over a set of clamps glued to the surface any day. I pre-sanded everything to 80 grit before moving on, just to make sure the surface would be a bit smoother at the end. After that, I poured another thin layer of epoxy to even things out and get everything nice and level. By the way, this table ended up using about 27 kilograms or about 60 pounds of epoxy. I know it sounds like a lot, but it was necessary to get that perfect clean finish. Even though I had to do a little bit more sanding after that, I really feel like this extra layer helped me a lot with the end result. The table ended up way better than I expected. But hey, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think that extra step was really necessary? Let me know down in the comments. I really love to hear your opinions. And by the way, if you're enjoying this video, it would really mean a lot if you could subscribe to the channel. I know most of you are probably watching this on a TV, and I totally get that it's a bit tricky to subscribe from there. But if you can, hitting the subscribe button really helps me out and lets me keep making more content like this. Another fun fact about the color of the European walnut is that it's also influenced by the tree's environment. Trees grown in different regions or under varying conditions can produce walnut wood with distinct color variations. For instance, walnut from sunnier regions tend to develop deeper, more uniform brown tones, while walnut trees grown in cooler or more shaded areas may display lighter or even golden hues. Additionally, walnut trees that grow in rich, fertile soils may develop even more vibrant and varied colors with darker streaks or contrasting highlights in the grain. Alright, it's time to demold the table, and it looks like not using the Tyvek tape wasn't such a bad idea after all. The table came out pretty well, and I only had one side that stuck to the form. Maybe I didn't use enough mold release on that side, who knows. I do have another table without Tyvek, and that one, well, let's just say it stuck to the form a little too well. It was like the resin and the mold became lifelong best friends, and I'm the one who had to break them up. You'll see all that in that video of that table. Trust me, it's a whole different story. I'll just stop talking for about a minute so you can see how nice this one demolds. Even though I pre-sanded this table, I did have to plane it a little bit to make it a little bit better. It's time to sand. We'll start with 80 grit and we'll go up to 2000, I think. This is just preliminary sanding. What I'm doing here is I'm using 80 grit just to remove all the streaks that I got from planing the table. You'll see in a later video where I created this jig that I'm gonna be scrapping this version of the jig because it had deflection. So what I did here was just bring everything to a level where I could start really sanding on the table. As you can see, the first part is done. I still have to do the other side. Let me just show you. So now it's all even. Everything's fine. I still have to put 5-minute epoxy here in this hole and in these pinholes. here, some here, but more or less now we're flat, we're in the same plane, and I need to start again with 80 grit just to finish everything up here, then 120, 180, 220, and I think for the back side it's enough. For the front we'll go up to 2000, so this becomes clear. Most probably here in these areas I'll go up to 2000 on the back as well, so it will be clear. Speaking of planing, I use the planing jig that I built from CNC parts. I've got a video on the works that shows how I made this jig, though it's important to note that this isn't the final version of it. This variant had some issues with deflection, and that really set me back. The deflection caused the jig to wobble slightly during planing, which resulted in uneven surfaces and left behind big marks. Unfortunately, that meant I had to spend extra time sanding the table to get rid of these marks, which kinda slowed down the process quite a bit, but as with any DIY project, is all part of the learning experience, right? I'm done with the face. But I'm having issues. I don't know if things can be seen on the camera, but I had a little bit of a tear out when I was planing this table, and of course it's on the face, so I'm going to, we have here some as well. I'm going to put some 5-minute epoxy in there. Hopefully it will be better, because I don't like it as it is right now. So if you look right here, now it's wet, and it's because I wanted to see where the tear out is. And yeah, there are a few places where there's tear out, but all in all it doesn't look that bad. I had to do this face with 40 grit to clean it up, but it's finally getting there. It's looking good. Hopefully it will get better. Let me just show you. Now that the table is starting to take shape, I need to address any small imperfections that may have popped up during the epoxy process. Since this is a clear epoxy table, every tiny flaw becomes very noticeable. Even the smallest pinholes can stand out. So I went over the entire surface carefully, looking for anything that could affect the final look. Once I found any imperfections, I filled them with CA glue. This is a crucial step, especially with clear epoxy, because it ensures the table will have a smooth and flawless surface. After applying the glue, I let it dry, and then I sanded it down to make sure it was level with the rest of the table, eliminating any bumps or unevenness. Once the glue was sanded and everything was smooth, I started the process of sanding the entire table to 120 grit. I wanted to make sure I had a good even surface, so I carefully went over every inch, working up to 120 grit. Sanding at this stage is super important because it helps to get rid of any leftover marks from the previous steps, and it creates a nice base for the finish later. This process also helps in evening out the epoxy and the wood surfaces, getting everything ready for the final shaping and cutting. After the sanding was done, I felt it was the right time to cut the table to its final dimensions. I used the track saw for this, but I had to make sure everything was perfectly square and the sides were parallel. It's crucial at this stage to get the cuts right because any mistake would show up once the table was fully finished. To start, I made a random straight cut on one of the shorter sides of the table just to create a clean, straight edge. From there, I measured from that first cut to the other side to make sure everything was aligned properly. Once I had both sides aligned, I used a speed square to check for squareness. Then I made a square cut on one of the long sides of the table. After that, I made another parallel cut to that side to ensure both long sides were parallel to each other. Trust me, not getting the dimensions right now means that you could end up with a smaller table later and might have to redo all those cuts. It's worth the effort to make sure everything is perfect now, so you don't have to go back and fix it later. Once the table was cut to the final dimensions, I used a small palm router with a roundover bit to round all the edges. I did this on all 4 sides to make sure that the table looks symmetrical and smooth. The roundover gives the table a nice soft finish and takes away the sharp corners, giving it a more polished, professional appearance. I wanted everything to flow together nicely, so I made sure to keep the same rounded edge all around. Now that the edges are rounded, it's time to clean the table properly. I gave it a good wipe down to make sure there was no dust or debris left over from the sanding. Once everything was clean, I started sanding again, working my way up to 180 grit. Sanding is a crucial step because it not only smooths out the surface, but it also helps prepare the wood for the finish. With a project like this, every detail counts, so taking my time during sanding is key. Sanding to 180 grit is important, especially when you plan to use a product like Rubio Monocoat. Rubio Monocoat calls for sanding the wood up to 180 grit to ensure the finish penetrates the wood properly. Going up to 180 ensures that the surface is smooth but still allows the wood to absorb oil-based finishes. If you go finer, like 220 or even 320 grit, the surface could become too smooth and the finish might not bond as well to the wood. At 180, you get the perfect balance of smoothness and texture for the oil to soak and do its job. After each grit, I make sure I pop the grain of the wood. This is a technique where you lightly mist the surface with water and let it dry before sanding it again. The water raises the fibers in the wood, making them more pronounced, and sanding them down again smooths everything out. This process helps open up the grain, allowing the finish to penetrate deeper and giving the table a better, more even finish. It's a small extra step, but it makes a very big difference when you want that perfect look. One of the things I pay special attention to while sanding is the direction of the wood grain. You always want to make sure to sand with the grain to avoid scratches that could mar the surface. If you go against the grain, even with the finest grit, you might leave marks that are difficult to remove later. By following the grain, the wood stays clean and the texture remains consistent. It's all about making sure the wood looks at its best before applying the finish. I also like to work slowly and methodically during this process. It's tempting to rush through sanding, but if you don't take your time, you could end up with uneven areas or imperfections that you'll see once the finish is applied. That would be frustrating after all the work you've put in, so I always make sure to spend the right amount of time on each section. I go over the whole surface multiple times to ensure it's completely smooth to the touch. I also keep a close eye out for any areas that might need extra attentions, like little gauges or scratches. In this case, I used the scribing technique to make sure that every inch of the table was evenly sanded. With larger surfaces, it can be easy to miss areas, but the scribing method helps me keep track of where I've already been. It's basically just a way to mark sections so I can stay organized to avoid skipping any spots. This extra attention to detail helps me create a perfectly even surface that's going to look amazing once the finish is applied. By the time I reach 180 grit, the table is feeling smooth, but it's still got a bit of texture to it. That texture is exactly what we need for the Rubio monocoat to properly bond to the wood. From now the span begins. I need to go to 8000 grit, I think 6000, we'll see when it turns clear. And I'll only go on the resin and not on the wood. The wood is still at 180 because I want to put Rubio on it. So we're going on this. We're right now at 400. We'll go 800, 1000, 1500, 2000. And after 2000 we'll see if if it doesn't turn clear. We'll start with wet sanding and then we're gonna polish. Let's see what happens. The finish will settle into the grain and really bring out the natural beauty of the walnut. At this stage, it's important to check the surface one more time to make sure that there are no last-minute imperfections or dust that could cause issues later. The sanding process has brought out the beautiful character of the walnut and it started looking amazing. The next step is where everything starts to come together and I can't wait to see the transformation. Now that the wood is ready, it's time to focus on the epoxy. As you can see, it's starting to look pretty good, but to really bring out its clarity, we need to do some sanding. I started by sanding the epoxy with 800 grit. This might seem like a lot of work, but trust me, it's worth it. Epoxy can often look cloudy and dull at first, but as we work through the different grits, it gradually clears up and transforms. I then moved to 1000 grit, followed by 1500 and then 2000 grit. At this point, the epoxy is starting to really shine, but we're not done yet. Now we start wet sanding to really refine the surface. Wet sanding helps smooth everything out while preventing dust buildup and keeping the surface clean. I continue with 3000 grit and then finally finish with 6000 grit. At this stage, the epoxy looks crystal clear, but it's still not quite perfect. It's incredibly smooth, but to get that mirror-like finish, the next step is polishing. Wet sanding helps bring the clarity of the epoxy, but we still need to polish it to make it truly shine. After this, I use 3M polishing compound along with a polishing machine to buff out to a high glass-like finish. The polishing machine really helps speed up the process and ensures a smooth, even shine. The 3M compound works wonders at bringing out the final level of clarity. The more you polish, the more the epoxy shines, and it starts to look like it's part of the wood, perfectly highlighting the walnut grain underneath. This step takes some time, but once it's done, the table will have that flawless, high-end finish everyone loves. Now it's time to apply Rubio monocoat. Over the past few years, it seems like Rubio has become pretty popular among YouTubers and woodworking enthusiasts. But if you've been around the woodworking community long enough, you'll know there's a bit of controversy around it. Some people absolutely love it, while others aren't as big of fans. It's definitely one of those products where people have strong opinions about it, but I'm here to tell you that it's the first time I've used it and I'm impressed. First off, I love how easy it is to use. You don't need to be super precise or worry about applying it in just the right way because Rubio is really forgiving. It's a one coat application and that's it. That's huge when you're working with a project like this table. It also has a beautiful sheen that brings out the natural colors of the wood without overpowering them. Whether you want a matte or glossy look, it does a great job of giving the surface a natural finish without looking too plasticky. Another great thing about Rubio Monocoat is that you can apply it in a dusty shop. That's something not all finishes allow for. If you're working in a small space like me, where dust is almost impossible to avoid, it's a huge plus. Normally, you'd need a perfectly clean space to apply a finish like this, but Rubio makes it much easier to work in less than ideal environments. There's just one thing I don't like about it, and that's the smell. I'm not gonna lie, when you first open the can and start applying it, the smell can be a bit overwhelming. But the good news is, it goes away after about 2 days. It's not a deal breaker for me, but if you're sensitive to strong odors, it might be something to consider. All in all, I'm really happy how Rubio worked with this table. It's easy to apply, has a great finish, and it's one of those products that really makes the wood look its best. I can see why so many people use it, and I can definitely recommend it if you're looking for an easy to use, high quality finish for your woodworking projects. That's it for today's project. I'm really happy with how this epoxy walnut table turned out. It's been an awesome journey from start to finish. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more of my woodworking projects, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on what's coming next. Also, if you're interested in learning more or want to check out some of the tools and finishes I use, head over to my website at polishedtimber.com for more information. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.